What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson, here with my co-hosts, Julia Gledhill and Matt Duss. What's good, friends?
Hello.
Good to see you. Hey, friends.
Oh, and so maybe we should mention it up front, or maybe at the end of the episode. I don't know. Where can people catch you guys, like Twitter handles or whatever?
Sure. Love the shameless self-promotion. You can find me on Twitter at Julia Gledhill. Very simple.
All in the hustle at Matt Duss. Never stop.
All right.
Never stop. Never stopping. All right.
I'm, of course, at Real Van Jackson because I'm real. So
is there a fake Van Jackson? I'm so curious.
There's a bunch of fake Van Jackson.
There are people trying to monetize their, there are people.
That's how you know you've made it.
They're mostly like MAGA bots too, which is kind of, I don't know, through the looking glass. But so, Matt, since we last talked, you did an interview with Isaac Chotiner in the New Yorker. And I think this is like your second time. Is that right?
It is. Survived now 2 interviews with Isaac.
That's
the
like
first one was
your arm in a bear's mouth, though. You know, like how.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Like the first time I did one, it was about Ukraine. It was back in the fall of 2022. He wanted to talk in the wake of that famous or infamous Ukraine letter, depending on your perspective.
Oh yeah.
From the Congressional Progressive Caucus, he just wanted to talk about the whole situation, the story, and I got this text from him, and I was like, man, if this were coming to my boss, I'd be like, throw your phone away. Do not answer that. Yeah. That's what a good press person would have done. But as I don't have a press person, I answered it. But no, I mean, I have a lot of respect for Isaac. I've known him for a while. I think he's great at getting people to kind of hang themselves with their
this is kind of what he's known for, among other
things. No,
yeah.
I mean, he does his homework. He knows what he's asking. But fortunately, all my arguments are solid and internally consistent. So that's what I've got going for me. But no, I appreciated obviously that he wanted to talk about the Biden ceasefire offer. That's what we talked about, Biden ceasefire play, which I thought was a bold move, and I had my criticisms of it, which I described to Isaac, and unfortunately are kind of being borne out now. The basic argument, which I said was in my MSNBC piece as well, which we talked about in our last episode, which is that Biden laid out this whole kind of proposal. He went public with it, which was, in his view, an escalation, but he did not have an or else for Netanyahu. It was like pressing Netanyahu, putting pressure on Netanyahu and Hamas to accept the deal, but there was no or else for Netanyahu, and we've seen Netanyahu do what he always does in these situations, which is delay and cast doubt and simply refuse to make a choice.
Did you see what Netanyahu just said, like right before we jumped on this, about to Secretary Blinken? It's unfathomable, something about what did he say? What was the issue? I mean,
it has to do with the withholding of certain weapons, and let's recognize, like, this was the withholding of just 2,000-pound bombs. That's it. Some very large destructive weapons that the U.S. frankly should not have been providing for this war anyway. I mean, this is as you
very broad gauge, right. Crude,
right, exactly. A weapon that is, especially in an extremely densely populated area, which Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. I mean, this is an indiscriminate weapon.
It's an anti-precision weapon. Is basically
that's exactly right. And yet Netanyahu is, believes this video outrage that Israel has been denied this weapon. And I know they were leaking that Blinken, I guess, promised that they would restart supply of these weapons. I've asked some colleagues at the State Department about that, and they're like, no, we haven't heard that yet. But again, I think the basic takeaway is, like, once again, Netanyahu shows how grateful he is for the absolutely unstinting support of President Biden, which is that he's going to release this video attacking the Biden administration and essentially helping Trump, which is who he wants to be president.
And dissolving his war cabinet, right? Just this week.
Right.
He said in the video he would finish the job. Give him the weapons he wants, and he would finish the job. It doesn't sound great.
Yeah. What's the job? I think. Well,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we know.
Well, he analogized to Churchill specifically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Yeah.
Not great. All right. Well, it's amazing that you can stick your arm in a bear's mouth twice and come out. So
Well, thank you.
Congratulations.
Well,
It's
thank you.
unfortunate that the topic
But
is
see, the dangerous thing now is like having done 2, I want to go for the hat trick, which is where where things get really risky. So maybe
you're
you
gonna
can
confess to being a fascist or something.
you can both talk me down. I'll let you know when I get that text.
Yeah. Julia, you have something about ICBMs, or
I do. Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to highlight a piece from Eliana Johns from the Federation of American Scientists, who wrote a really compelling piece for Inkstick about the just incoherent security rationale for ICBMs and about the need to reconsider continued investment in them. Super timely as the United States undergoes an estimated $130 billion effort to replace our existing intercontinental ballistic missiles with the Sentinel program, and modernize the nuclear triad writ large, which the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimates is going to cost us $2 trillion in the next 30 years. But what Eliana's piece did really well was kind of highlight the human community dangers of ICBM. She draws on her grandfather's experience as a missileer in 1980 when the accidental dropping of a wrench caused the ejection of a nuclear warhead in Arkansas that thankfully did not detonate.
Oh man, that's awkward.
Yeah. But the Damascus accident is just one of several accidents in nuclear weapons over the years, several of which have taken many lives. Yet we have 400 missiles sitting in silos in Montana, North Dakota, other places, and we're replacing all of them again at incredible cost. So I thought it was a good piece.
Yeah, it was a fantastic piece. I had a policy report out a few weeks ago about nuclear risk reduction in East Asia, and it was pretty wonky and really fucking long. But one of the deeper recommendations in the thing that like hasn't gotten a lot of attention but converges with this very nicely is to basically reduce or eliminate the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is ICBMs, right? And like Eliana mentions this in her piece, but Thomas Schelling, who's the fucking guru wizard of coercive violence, he wrote in the 80s about needing to eliminate the ICBM force because it makes American territory into a target. It creates incentives for the adversary to light up the American homeland, and we don't get a lot out of it. Like in terms of added deterrence or whatever, we're covered with subs and bombers if you're going to subscribe to that logic in the first place. And so the recommendation in the report that we had was like, we need to cut our overall ICBM force by at least 100. We need to denuclearize our ICBM force, retrofit conventional warheads on them, which basically turns it into like a prompt global strike capability because they can still strike anywhere. And that's still not great, but it's progress of a sort. And part of the other recommendation was like put the remaining ICBMs, a much smaller overall force, a denuclearized force, on mobile launchers, which reduces the incentive, literally the ability for enemies to target them. And so like these are all sort of halfway progress measures toward the elimination of the ICBM leg. And why would you do that? Because it doesn't really add anything to deterrence. It turns entire communities in America that are co-located with them into sacrifice zones. Yeah. It, increases the prospects of nuclear accidents. It costs a fucking arm and a leg. And again, like, what do we get? Like, for what? For what? So it was a great piece.
Yeah, and it encourages first use, right? Like, especially when the United States won't clarify whether we would use nuclear weapons first. I mean, it's kind of what she explains to be a use it or lose it mindset. So, yeah, unfortunately, the like halfway measures are important, and yeah, I think we all grapple with incremental policy change in this field. It's important though.
Yeah, I mean, the main benefit of ICBMs is supposed to be that it gives the president a push button nuke capability, but because like you never know, a bomber could get shot down or a submarine could get lost or something, or you lose comms, and so the ability of a president to be able to just like get a hard on and push a button and go no matter what, like that's supposed to be an advantage. But in the age of like Trump and MAGA and like impulse based foreign policy, I can't think of a more ridiculous, dangerous thing than like push button nuclear war. You know, like you flip the switch and then it's done, and it's because the guy had a bad day or something. Like that's something that obviously should be arrested. Anyways,
100%.
in the news. So I guess the main thing I wanted to mention was that Arundhati Roy, who's a best-selling author, she won the Booker Prize a few years ago. She had this book that went wild sales, The Ministry for Utmost Happiness. She did a book with John Cusack. She's a big deal. And she's been a reliable voice of conscience going back to the 90s, as far as I know. Well, Narendra Modi's regime in India is now prosecuting her under anti-terrorism legislation for comments she made about Kashmir in a speech 14 fucking years ago. Okay, so I mean, a couple of thoughts here. One, every country that has anti-terrorism legislation seems to use it as a tool of oppression. It's always a way to control or censor society. It rarely seems to be about preventing fucking terrorism very often, you know? And then the other thing is like Modi has very clearly shown himself to be a Hindu nationalist trending into Hindu fascism. And it's not just because he runs extrajudicial, extraterritorial assassination campaigns. It's not just because he's an anti-feminist. It's not just because he doesn't respect sovereign borders. It's because also his regime is a merger between religious ethno-nationalism and oligarchs who impose neoliberalism on their own country still. And all the leading thinkers in India and in India's diaspora have basically been warning that Modi is a fascist. You know, Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, of course.
I mean, he's in the process of the one of the largest, if not the largest and most intense biometric data collection projects in the world. Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, I've talked to researchers who are doing work on this, and it is absolutely staggering what they could be preparing to do with this information.
National registries, right?
Yes,
based on your party loyalty, your religious ethnicity, all this stuff. Yeah. Right. And so like it's kind of obvious that we're dealing with a fascist, you know, doesn't respect national borders, to say nothing of like minority rights, free speech, etc. So what are we going to do?
Biden gave him a state dinner.
Yes. What we're looking at fascists in the face.
Yeah.
You know, what are we going to do? We're going to sell them more weapons. Right? We're going to invite him to a picnic on Capitol Hill and kiss his
This is
hand.
our bulwark against China. This is your brain on strategic competition.
Yeah, it's very troubling, especially because this is over something that is like Arundhati Roy has been a sort of righteous critic of Modi, of course, but like what they're prosecuting her on in the name of fighting terrorism is a speech act. It's words that she said out loud, and it's not even like this just happened. This is so retroactive. You know,
the parallel to our own war on terror infrastructure is incredibly troubling. And also it's like Arundhati Roy is a national treasure, right, for India. This is an extension of what the people in Kashmir have faced for such a long time. I mean, the police violence, the limited access to the internet, like it doesn't even matter what the Indian Supreme Court says about these things. Like the people of Kashmir are experiencing just incredible levels of systemic violence and direct violence against them that this captures, in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, like, it's precisely that going after one of the most prominent authors in the world for something she said 14 years ago is the point, right? For an authoritarian government, it's like, that's the point. The ridiculousness is the point. Something, yeah, we're going to go, it doesn't matter who you are, because we're going to go after this award-winning author for something she said over a decade ago. Imagine what we'll do to you.
Yeah. There's a version of like a perverse Sinatra test going on where it's in this. I mean, we should have seen it as a signpost or whatever, that like, if they're willing to conduct assassinations on the territory of like global North governments, even in Canada, even in Australia, even in America, if they're
at
willing
the exact same moment, I'm at the state dinner, he's at the state dinner and speaking to Congress at that exact moment. Yes.
This is what happens when you don't try to hold anyone accountable and you kiss their ass while they do bad things. They do more bad things, So
this is your brain on strategic competition. That's
going to come back in the next segment we're going to do. But yes, that's fucking nightmare. One thing that just popped in my mind to mention that we didn't prep for, but it's just egregious, so I'll just mention it quickly. Robert O'Brien, Trump's one of his 4 national security advisors, I think the last one. Robert O'Brien has a piece that's about to drop in Foreign Affairs, and among the like many, many, many crazy things he says in it, many, he says that the Trump next presidency or whatever should consider moving the entire U.S. Marine Corps to Asia. Okay, that's 186,000 active duty troops. 186,000. Also, Guam, for the past 15 years, the Marine Corps has been trying to relocate like 6,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam. It's taken like 15 years. It's only just starting to happen. And it's proving to be environmentally devastating, socially disruptive, economically problematic for Guam. Guam's having to go through it. It's going through it. Over 6,000 troops at most, right? 186,000. How's that going to go? At whose expense?
I don't know, Van. I'm kind of disturbed at your lack of faith in America's ability to get her done. I mean, what are you saying here?
This, I mean, aside from
it's not all about having the will to do it.
Will to power. That sounds familiar.
Right.
Dude, yeah. It's bananas. There was a lot that's bananas. And more MAGA technocrats. So the Mike Gallaghers, the Matt Pottingers, the Robert O'Briens, the John Boltons, they're all Stephen Millers. They're all starting to say shit that is like outlining what MAGA kind of foreign policy is going to be. And like,
oh yes. I mean, that is, something to keep in mind. They very much have a plan.
Okay. So best take, worst take. Matt, you have a best take for us?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying this just because we're on the same podcast here, but I really liked your map of DC think tanks. I thought it was really interesting, some of the choices you made, but just generally, it's good to have a sense of the landscape of who's coming from where. There was, dark side, the rebels, and it depends. We're the kind of 3 categories. But I will just say one of the things I thought was interesting was that you did not have, at least I don't think you did. I looked a few times, like I didn't see the American Enterprise Institute in there.
Oh yeah.
Which was really interesting to me because, at least when I came to DC, and again, for most of, the early 2000s, certainly the war on terror, like AEI was the agenda setting. It was just the go-to place.
Yeah.
Where the neocons sat, where, the Iraq war was devised. All these people were like, working with Ahmed Chalabi to kind of represent themselves as speaking for the true Iraq liberation movement. And, and then that's where the surge was devised out of AEI.
Home of
And
John Bolton for a long time.
home of John Bolton for a long time, Bill Kristol, a number of all those people we know and love.
Kagan,
yeah.
Fred Kagan, before he moved over and started the Institute for the Study of War, which is basically doing the same thing. But it's actually it's interesting now because they still have people like Danielle Pletka, who was again one of those neocons who was arguing for the war and continued to argue for it, and to this day has never admitted that it was a horrible idea. But it's also got people like Corey Shockey, who I know, and even though she's very much she's more on the hawkish side, is actually someone you can have like a good faith discussion and argument with about the uses of American power. So I would kind of put it in the independents column, which is I can't believe I'm actually saying it right now, because again they have like ideas I don't agree with, but they've actually been engaged they've taken a lot of heat also, I would say, from the kind of MAGA right, because they're seen as just like unrepentant interventionists, which they are. But again, I would, I'm happy to have a discussion with people who are arguing honestly. And that is kind of my main critique of some of the folks you put on the dark side, like Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I mean, I think these guys are just completely full of shit.
They're very bad news. Yeah.
They really are. I mean, they were literally founded as a pro-Israel PR shop and then rebranded as a think tank because Washington is full of suckers. That was their trajectory. So, there are folks who are just not on the up and up. So I kind of make a distinction between these two things. Like, are there genuine doctrinal or ideological policy differences, which I think are good to debate, versus folks who are just kind of like hiding the ball.
Yeah. So like I left off AEI. I think I left off the Wilson Center and like New America. I left off a few, but basically for people as a reference point, I had a newsletter post basically it was sharing an email that I had sent to a former student, and the student was asking for advice about like internships and navigating DC and stuff. And she was a progressive as far as I could tell, but she had told me a couple places where she had applied, and I was like, what the fuck are you applying? I didn't say that, but like my reaction was like, what are you fucking doing applying to that place, So like as part of my response, I kind of laid out my sense of the political landscape of think tanks in DC and like kind of what they were, what each place was about a little bit. And I had binned them in terms of like dark side rebels and it depends.
Yeah.
Pretty unscientific, obviously. But I guess some of my choices were like a little controversial, but it was also super not comprehensive. So like I didn't put on heritage, although obviously about as dark as it fucking gets.
Yeah.
AEI, I would have totally put on the dark side, obviously.
Understandably.
But they do like you're saying something interesting here about AEI, because like I think they kind of represent a constituency that actually doesn't have it's not a political base. Like it's a small section of the ruling class.
That's right. That is, again, that's neoconservatism.
Yeah,
it is a bunch of think tankers and pundits backed by big donors.
Yeah,
I mean, they have they speak for no actual constituency of voters. I mean,
it's a money constituency, not a voting constituency. Yeah. And so that's kind of weird. I
think it's also really easy not really easy, but much easier to advance in your career at an institution like that when you have that kind of resourcing.
Right. And that's always been the key challenge for the left. It's like, I mean, the right has this enormous pool of donors who not just support them, but support them in the long term. They understand it's a long-term investment to create a kind of ecosystem for these kinds of batshit ideas.
Yeah. And when you and I, Matt, were sort of coming up through DC, there wasn't, I think we talked about this last episode a little bit, but like you basically had like the Center for American Progress was kind of the leftmost institution that you could realistically kind of glom onto. And there weren't a ton of opportunities there. And then that was kind of it. Like IPS was low key, CIP was low key. And that was, and then Stimson is like probably the sort of best mainstream
Yeah.
think tank, but they had pretty, especially back then, like a really low profile.
Yeah.
And so what do you do? Like, how do you,
Mhm.
there were no alternative. There is no alternative, right? There was no
Mm.
alternatives really.
Yeah, it's fun. The advice you gave to your student, I'd love to hear what Julia has to say about this, because I've spoken to I speak to young people whenever they want to talk about their careers. I mean, because people gave me that generosity when I was coming up, and I always try to pay that forward. But what I tell them is, especially if you're young and you don't have a long paper trail yet, take any opportunity, with some exceptions. Like, but understand your own principles and understand your own red lines. I mean, even if you're going to kind of a more right-leaning place, I mean, that's a valuable intelligence gathering opportunity. It will help you start to build experiences and potentially a network. Some of those are not nodes that you would want to call on later. But again, all within reason. But I tend to encourage young people to cast their nets pretty widely, if they want to get experience in foreign policy. In part because, because the opportunities on the left are fairly slim. That's something I think we're all trying to change. But at least to create a bigger bench of more experienced, left foreign policy professionals, I think it makes sense to encourage them to just get that experience where they can get it.
Yeah, I mean, I think casting a wide net is always a good idea, because my mom always says this, apply for everything and you can decide later if you actually get the offer.
Yeah.
You're not married to any application that you submit, or any choice you make for that matter. But I think that particularly, if you are able to cultivate a skill set, whether it's advocacy or writing or both, casting that wide net can be particularly helpful. I don't necessarily think you should work for people that whose principles are completely misaligned with yours. However, in the world of military restraint, there is a lot of ideological diversity, and that does foster, I think, a lot of intellectual growth that can be really helpful. I will just say I would have loved this list in college, Van. So for listeners who haven't, paid for Undiplomatic, it's like that alone is worth the whatever $5 it is a month.
Yeah, upper coffee. Yeah. No, I think I agree with all of that. The thing, it's way more important now than it used to be to know yourself. To know what you're about, and what kind of commitments you have, and what kind of red lines you have, and all that. Back in the day, I think that was the missing part when I was talking about how we were coming up. It wasn't just that there was a lack of alternatives. It was, I think, or at least for me, I had been socialized into assuming that if you had a fancy institution on Mass Ave, that surely, in the gold, brass, marble, whatever, surely power equals virtue. Surely resources equals public good. Surely CSIS has earned its standing and therefore is credible and legitimate and the great and the good. And surely I want to be part of that, and that's not correct. That's what
it is not. It is not. No.
Yeah. So I literally talked to somebody, a junior person at CSIS recently. They had come to the Busboys and Poets event we did actually on progressive foreign policy.
Cool.
And they basically told me, I hope I'm not outing it. No, this is anonymous. They told me there's a whole cadre of underlings at specifically CSIS who are not on the same wavelength as their bosses.
Oh man,
and
I was one of
they're
them.
very cynical about it, kind of.
My first internship in DC was CSIS, man. I worked with Anthony Cordesman on a project on the Iraqi insurgency. I was glad to do it. It was a great gig. Cordesman was great. I mean, I don't align with CSIS, but that was a great experience. But I mean, going back to what I said and what you've said about understanding, what ultimately my principles are, and had I been asked to kind of violate those, I was not. I mean, my project is not CSIS's project, but in that experience, I think it was extremely helpful.
Yeah. you can get the experience at any number of places that you need, you know, and some of those places may not be right for you. But I guess that's the thing. It's like you got to have your head on straight, or have that sense of like what you're about in order to be able to navigate it. And I think, like, for me, what am I about was not something I had reflected on very much. I just assumed that, like, if you were in the room, or like you were part of the conversation, or aligning yourself with powerful people, like, well, it all shakes out. And that's to be that powerful is good.
Right.
And that sounds crazy to me now, but like, that's kind of what I just assumed, or was naturalized. And like, that's just so not the case anymore.
Right.
Yeah. Well, oh, also I don't know if, I'll say this. AEI, I'll keep this one anonymous too. A guy who was like a friend of mine in 2016, Trump wins, of course. 2017, everything's upside down. And all the establishment foreign policy people are like trying to figure out, what do you do? Like, what to do? How do we deal with this? How do we all become political refugees like Jackson? You know, all this kind of thing. And in that context of total topsy-turviness, he was at a mainstream think tank, and then he got an offer to go to AEI, and the offer was absurd, right? And at the time, I was not in my headspace that I'm in now. I basically like encouraged him to go to AEI, because I was like, oh, that's liberal. Liberalism's under attack. We're all liberals now. All of that, of course, is false. But that was my thinking at the time. So I was like, well, that's not so bad. And the thing professionally about the AEI was that there's so much money, you didn't have to fundraise.
Yeah.
And you weren't really accountable for anything, so long as you stayed within the party line about military primacy and interventionism and neoliberalism.
No, that is such, I mean, that's a perfect, I mean, it's a perfect I'm like, this ecosystem they've created enables freedom and independence and creativity within certain boundaries for young professionals. And the creativity is all in service to really horrible, destructive ideas. But they're enabled to and supported in thinking, you know, about these ideas. And the left, or even the center left, has nothing comparable to this.
Yeah. We need resources.
Not having to fundraise is huge. AEI also, I think, has maybe the fanciest corner real estate I've seen as far as think tanks go in DC.
Oh, right. No, it's right there. It's on Massachusetts Avenue, and it's literally connected to Carnegie, which is then connected to Brookings.
Right.
Which, I mean, I was on a Brookings panel a few years ago when I was at Carnegie with Corey Shockey. So I was just like, I just wanted to note that, like, the fact that these three think tanks are all literally part of the same building just affirms every left critique.
I know, it's so
I mean,
bad look.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Corey Shockey thing reminds me, though, like, I don't know if you guys have ever talked to other neocons like Paul Wolfowitz or John Bolton or even like Rumsfeld.
I don't tend to talk to them.
Well, so
Rumsfeld especially, because he's passed.
I've had sort of brief encounters with all of these people, and some of them are like friends of friends because of my former misgivings, but all of these people are genuinely pleasant people interpersonally. Like, neocons are warmongers. They are, I mean, in some cases, war criminals, actually. But interpersonally, they come across as affable.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that is often the case. No, but that's just often the case. I mean, with people in general. I mean, my experience that it's rare to kind of, you know, encounter these people who are just like objectionable, horrible, disagreeable people. It has happened. But, you know.
No, it's very disconcerting. You know, they're even like fun at parties. I always felt this way in school, especially with the Hamilton Society folks, because those are the sort of adversary to the John Quincy Adams Society, which is, you know, we've talked about this, I think, before, but Yeah, it's freaking weird. You start to get into it with these people and you're like, oh, we are not familiar. We are not connected. Like it's unless you're actually in a place where you can meaningfully engage and they are doing that, to your earlier point, Matt, it's typically not worth it because it's just so unsettling.
But I mean, I'll also say here, I mean, I'm just a supporter, like, engage with people's ideas, attack them as vigorously as you can. But I think it's worth it if you encounter people at a personal level, there's no, there are certain cases where this is not true. I mean, someone like Rumsfeld, I mean, if I could, I would have just put him under citizen's arrest. But some of these others, I mean, you're there. I mean, I tend to just want to be, courteous and polite. You're there at a personal level. You're having a discussion when that happens. Again, attack the ideas, but
Yeah.
we live in a society.
Totally. Bow out gracefully if needed.
If needed, yeah. I mean, if it's not worth it, don't do it. But again, I think, I tend to try to find the humanity in anyone. Sometimes it's hard.
It's possible you're just a better person than me. And so, but like, I cannot, I mean, so the way I deal with this a lot of times is like, I just preemptively bow out of situations where I think there's a chance I might end up in a fist fight with this guy. And like, I try to foreclose on, like, you can look ahead and be like, I can imagine a scenario where this goes really fucking bad. Yeah. And so in order to like avoid that from happening, I'll just like, I'll decline the invitation or I'll steer away from that kind of shit. But I think I don't know, like there's something to be said for civility. My concern is that civility sort of is the on-ramp to tragedy and catastrophe. It's a way, right. It's a mechanism for laundering at a certain point. But
no, I think the danger is if you're using that as an excuse not to attack their ideas, their dangerous ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a kind of decision and that everyone needs to make for themselves. But.
Yeah. And then I just have possibly the lack of self-control, like to be other than emotional about things where people die. I don't know.
Yeah. No. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, the stakes are high. I mean, but I'll just use that as an example. Like the other day I was at, a kind of meeting with a bunch of people, and there was someone, who was in the Bush administration, who was very much a part of the Iraq War, who had played a role in one of the most, extraordinary tragedies and crimes of our era. And I knew that he had gone through a very serious loss recently in his family. And I just, went and gave him my condolences just at a personal level. I think that's worth doing. It doesn't lessen my hatred of what he played a part of, but like, I just felt like it was worth it in that moment to just, relate to him as a human being.
Yeah. I'll try harder.
Not telling you what to do, man. Gotta go at it in a way that works for you. I'm just telling you what works for me.
Yeah, no, there's we've all got a humanity, and it's important to recognize that. I think when you start dehumanizing people, that's when you start doing crazy shit, or like ends justifies the means starts taking over, and that's a problem. Yeah. Okay. So my best take is from the Center for International Policy. Hey, so Reuters has an investigation, excellent investigation, with smoking gun proof that in the middle of the pandemic, late 2020, the Pentagon ran a global anti-vaccine disinformation campaign specifically to inflate threat perceptions about China. And they did this at a time when the global South was being forced to choose between China's vaccine or no vaccine at all, because American supplies were being hoarded, A, but also B, Pfizer was price gouging the global South. And like, that's something that's only come out more recently. And so this is absolute scumbag shit, but CIP issued a statement condemning it. And I just want to read like a snippet of the condemnation that CIP issued. They said, quote, Spreading dangerous lies about vaccines and personal protective equipment among an especially hard-hit population is inhumane in and of itself. To have done so for the sole purpose of eroding public perceptions about China in a partner country, while callously disregarding the certainty that it would jeopardize the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocents, is utterly indefensible. It is dangerous to let an abstract geopolitical concept override the urgent necessity of saving human lives. The outrage and distrust of the United States this cruel gambit is already beginning to engender demonstrates some of the inherent dangers of the great power competition mindset that is shaping U.S. foreign policy across the globe. Well said. That's my best take.
Agree. Thanks. No. I mean, I'll just say briefly. I mean, when I saw that story, it just blew my mind. And one thing I just want to note here is like, this is going to have a very long tail. I mean, and what it immediately brought to mind was the effort to use vaccination as an intelligence gathering tool around the bin Laden assassination. I mean, this stuff, NGOs continue to report over 10 years later that this still creates problems for them. People are suspicious, rightly, because they know that these, humanitarian programs supported by the U.S. government, what are they really doing? It's just not worth it.
It discredits us. Yeah.
It discredits us, and it's actually
long tail.
In addition to, ethically, it's bad enough. But I'm just saying, like, especially in this case, fewer people being vaccinated hurts us. I mean, fewer people being vaccinated creates the opportunity for other variants that will come back that are vaccine proof, that will come to this country. So even leaving aside the moral and ethical arguments, there is just a security argument for not doing this shit.
Totally. Yeah. We continue to fail to see collective public health and safety as a priority. The government doesn't care. They just truly don't care about most people. So that's super grim.
And let's note, it was a Trump administration, program, which the Biden administration, after a few months, and I assume what was, the usual kind of lumbering, slow review process, did ultimately, after a few months, shut it down, as they goddamn well should have. But this just shows you what's sort of in store in a Trump 2 administration.
Yeah, so part of it is like what Trump and MAGA kind of the permissive environment that they create. Some of it is like, Pottinger specifically was pretty maniacal about redirecting the resources of the intelligence community toward confirmation bias and that kind of thing. But this is also a case where the Pentagon bureaucracy itself was finding their personal and moral redemption in the villainy of China. And so ends justifies the means, because the ends they think is supremely moral, all of which is a deflection from the fact that they're working for a fascist, And so one of the things that concerns me about this of many things is that it kind of shows an example where the bureaucracy itself is harboring a kind of dark ideology, and that it more easily finds expression in a Trump administration, but it's also partially responsible. Everything is not at the feet of political appointees, even though they need to be held to account. The national security state itself is metastasizing a kind of sick ideology, and it is very power is virtue, and it's this Schmittian Manichaean good evil. Everything we do is exculpatory. Everything they do is condemnatory and villainous, and it's bad shit. It's bad shit.
Indeed.
Julia, do you have good shit?
Yeah, I do actually. I'm going to continue the trend of boosting our colleagues, I guess. So my colleague at the Stimson Center, Emma Ashford, recently wrote about the validity of the assumptions that the US government is making about the war in Ukraine. So she discusses Ukraine spending, its affordability, its domestic impacts, but she also digs into prevailing narratives about both the trajectory and the potential outcomes of the war. So obviously there's a lot to cover here. I'm going to do my best to give the top lines, but what really stood out to me in her analysis was her discussion of returning Ukraine to its post-Soviet 1991 borders. Obviously, that's been Kyiv's goal really from the beginning of the war. I mean, Zelensky has said since very early on that Ukraine was going to take back Crimea, and Biden has kind of implicitly validated that goal by saying, you know, we'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we'll stand by Ukraine. Now, folks have questioned this approach across the political spectrum for various reasons. You have House Republicans who introduced a bill last fall to defund the mission in Ukraine, while people like, you know, Stephen Wertheim have argued that the United States can, in fact, defend Ukraine's sovereignty without co-signing a bid to take Crimea back from Russia, which would be incredibly costly in human, financial terms, and it would risk significant escalation with Russia. Now, Emma similarly questions this goal of returning Ukraine to its 1991 borders, but she does it by challenging the assumption that this goal of returning to Ukraine to these borders would actually create a more durable peace, which is not something I had read a lot about, and thought it was particularly insightful to ask this question of like, why would reclaiming territory, this particular territory lost to Russia, necessarily better protect Ukraine from potential future aggressions, while the economic and sort of political challenges persist. And I think it's an important question to consider, especially as the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland has recently finished up, and we saw like dozens of countries kind of sign on to this communique that says that territorial integrity is kind of the foundation of any future peace agreement. Noteworthy that Israel was present and participating in this summit.
Huge fans of territorial integrity, as we know.
Right.
Matt, what do you think? You were one of the leading voices on the Ukraine thing. So,
I mean, listen, I think territorial integrity and borders of a country as recognized by the United Nations is obviously the best starting point. I mean, that is righteous. That is in accordance with international law. Now, realistically, listen, I think if Putin came out today and said, listen, I'm willing to call it right here, we keep what we've got, the rest is Ukraine, do we take that deal? Yeah, we take that deal. If there was a durable peace in the offing. I think that's always, for me, been the kind of missing piece of this equation. That Putin has shown no evidence that he is genuinely interested in that kind of agreement. I guess we can, there's an argument to be had about whether, Biden's sort of rhetoric on this has been helpful or not. But I tend to think, like, as a position for the United States to take, the baseline is, listen, this is Ukraine. They have a right to want to take it back. But if we got into a negotiation where there was an actually durable peace to be had, and I think that's the key word, is durable. I mean, not just a ceasefire, not just a pause while, kind of Putin rearms and reorganizes for the next round. But if we were to end this thing for real in the long term, without Ukraine taking some of that territory back, I think that is absolutely worth considering. And I've written that in multiple places over the past year. Now, with regard to what this territory means, I think there is also the consideration of, like, how much of this territory does Ukraine need to remain viable economically? I mean, the coastline, the Black Sea coastline, is obviously a huge part of Russia's economic aims for this war, to protect Russia from, like, swings in energy markets by having more access to the Black Sea, and that's a question for Ukraine as well.
Yeah. I can understand as an opening bid in a hypothetical negotiation that's not happening, that you would insist on the restoration of old conquest, old borders.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, that's not something that I mean, on just the balance of forces right now, it doesn't look like Ukraine would be able to defend that or insist upon that.
Yeah.
Like, so negotiations would make that unrealistic. And like, I thought Emma, I had not even seen this piece from Emma. So once again, there's like so much stuff kind of floating that I'm always trying to like keep up on reading wise that I miss good stuff sometimes. But I thought this was like actually a very thoughtful piece. And I think she's probably right that it's an unrealistic assumption. But I don't know if it's like an internally held assumption. Like, is it an opening bid that, you know, I mean, I'm sure Ukraine would be willing to keep fighting to, you know, retake Crimea, but I don't know if the Biden administration would go with that.
I mean, I think there's two. I mean, one is I want to just say, like, having said what I just said about, you know, would we accept that deal? Let's recognize what that means for, you know, speakers who
For you too, or is it just?
You just froze that whole. I missed that whole thing.
Sorry, I was just saying. I mean, having said what I just said about being willing to take a deal if it was real and durable, I do think it's worth acknowledging what that means for Ukrainians who would be then, you know, consigned to live in Russian occupied territory, or what would then become Russia. That is not great. So I want to just acknowledge that reality.
Absolutely.
I don't want to speak cavalierly about what that means. And also, like, politically for Zelensky, I mean, and this is what I wrote in my piece that I published in the New Republic in December after visiting Ukraine a few weeks before that, is like, that would potentially be just politically impossible for Zelensky to sell. I mean, there would be you would have to like combine this with an enormous package for Ukraine, economic and reconstruction and all kinds of things, security guarantees, et cetera, to make this remotely politically saleable to Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's the addressing the economic and political factors that I think is key to like considering how impactful taking back this territory could be on a potential like durability of a peace agreement. And like notably, I mean, there were several countries that came to this peace summit in Switzerland this week that didn't sign for various reasons. And well, you know, like Saudi and India didn't sign because Russia wasn't invited, which isn't terribly surprising. But no, I certainly agree that it's something that needs to be considered in the context of kind of, I think what others have coined like armed neutrality. I know, who is it? Ben Friedman, maybe at Defense Priorities has written about this. And, you know,
yeah, and I go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, there was more. Just a couple of days ago, maybe just yesterday, there was a report. The New York Times got a whole bunch of documents from the kind of March and April 2022 negotiations between Ukraine and Russia over a potential way to end the war, which, you know, fell apart for a number of reasons. I think there tends to be this very, you know, this persistent myth on some parts of the left that like they were at the brink of a peace movement, and then Boris Johnson showed up and was like, "Don't make peace," which I think is a very silly story. But what these documents show is like, you know, Putin basically wanted, even if there was going to be a security guarantee for Ukraine, even if it didn't join NATO and had some kind of security guarantee from the United States and other countries, Russia wanted a veto, wanted to have to approve that guarantee being honored, which is just mind-bogglingly dumb. I mean, that just defeats the entire purpose.
Right.
So again, I think already what's been reported, Yaroslav Trofimov wrote a book about this, the reporter from the Wall Street Journal, that included some of these details as well. But again, going back to my original point, like if there was a durable, you know, agreement in the offing, now we absolutely should explore it. I mean, anytime Putin makes these noises about being willing to end this, I think we should explore it. And frankly, I think the administration has been, perhaps not as like kind of publicly as I think some people might want. But I also think the truth is Putin is kind of just waiting it out. He knows that there's a chance that Biden will not be reelected, and he'll be in a position to get a much better deal.
He might be right. I mean, that's the problem. That's part of the problem here. Yeah. Well, okay. Fuck. So
That's how we gotta end every segment, you know.
yeah.
Well, okay.
Well, so there's some good news in the final by the numbers segment. So
Yes.
just as a reminder, by the numbers, one of us or more than one of us is going to bring a number. That number is going to be the starting point for a story. It's going to
Mhm.
shed light on a problem or a solution. It's going to be edifying. And what the fuck was that? Okay. So the number, I got a number. It's $38 million. This story is fucking crazy. Chiquita Banana death squads. Okay. So everybody who's not just been absolutely lied to their whole lives knows that United Fruit Company, American agriculture was the historical basis for American empire. Like, not just formal empires in the Pacific, but also
Mhm.
rationalizing the Monroe Doctrine and the recurring military invasions
Mhm.
we launched in Latin America, the coups we planned in Latin America, right? You can't
Mhm.
separate the history of American violence in the Southern Hemisphere from the entrepreneurial capitalist needs of American ag. So that shit's not ancient history. It's
Nope.
all the way up to the 2000s. And nobody's ever really been held to account for
Yep.
this dark history. But
Yep.
now we've got $38 million of accountability. So a Florida court just ordered Chiquita Brands International to pay $38 million to 8 families in Colombia because people and their families were murdered by a right-wing death squad that was financed by Chiquita Banana. It's called the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the
Mhm.
AUC. It emerged in the 80s, and according to The Guardian, it was responsible for most of the 450,000 casualties in Colombia's narco wars over the decades. And Chiquita kept paying these guys into the 2000s, even after the AUC was designated a terrorist organization by the US. So
Mhm.
it took 17 years for this lawsuit to go through. It's a tiny amount of money compared to the murder and the pillaging of entire countries over 150 years. But this is the first time that an American multinational has been found guilty for human rights abuses in another country in our courts. And it creates a legal precedent. And that's enough for crafty good guy lawyers to file more lawsuits like
Yep.
this in the future. So 38 million bucks.
Yep.
Hell yeah.
It is.
Hopefully
Hell
see
yeah.
much more of it.
It is. It is good news because, as you know, I mean, like, and Chiquita Brands absorbed United Fruit Company, or what United Fruit Company had become, which was one of the main kind of companies that like actually gave rise to the term Banana Republic. Um, for these Central Latin American governments that are dominated by these corporate interests, which just knocked them off when they didn't like them.
Yeah.
So that is the legacy here.
Some measure of justice.
Yeah.
Took
No,
a
but I
long
think the
time.
precedent here, I mean, what people can do with this is, I
Yeah.
think the right people are very scared right now. And that
Yeah.
pleases me.
You want to give ammunition to people to do good things later,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
because we weren't given that. And that's why DC sucks.
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
so
But I
yeah.
think, I mean, just last point on this is like also understanding like these companies based, straightforwardly as instruments of U.S. foreign policy.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
treat them as like, oh, these are private companies. They're doing it's like, no, I mean, there's such a deep interconnected relationship here going both ways. And sometimes the questions are, well, who's really calling the shots? The companies or the government, or is there any meaningful distinction in some cases? In some cases, there is not. Um,
Yeah,
but this is an opportunity to start peeling that back.
totally. Yeah. Chipping away at I think what Chiquita would probably call a right to commerce, like a right literally a right to
Yeah.
pillage as long as they're making money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's peel that banana back, baby. All right. That's fun.
I was
So
gonna like that.
Should we end on a happy note?
yeah, any saved rounds?
Global corporation. I did have one, but I think I can save it. I can leave on we can leave on a happy note there. Anyone else?
Nope. I'm
Okay.
happy to end on holding multinationals accountable for something.
All right. Well, all right, gang, that's going to do it then. You want to help us out, pass our show to a friend, shout us out on socials, rate and review us wherever you hear this shit. And yeah, and then find us on the Twitters. So, all right. I guess we'll see you next time.
All right.
See
Thanks
y'all
a lot,
next
friends.
time.
All right. Take care.